Okay guys, I'll be going over chapter 6 and 7 with you, and at the end of the PowerPoint I'll go over what you should be focusing on as far as the FRQs go. Okay, so if you remember all the way back to when we had our chapter on learning, right? That's chapter 6. We did have a quiz on that, but it will be part of this exam as well. So remember, a big thing we want to know is that most learning is associative learning, meaning we learn that things happen together. Remember, this big guy, he learns, he knows that eating salad could give him the body of this guy. We learn that certain things occur together, just like we know with classical conditioning, dogs learn that with Pavlov, certain things went together, like a bell in their food, the presentation of their food. So that's associative learning. We know that there are three main types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then we also have observational learning. Remember, latent learning and insight learning are two types of observational learning, so that's not like a fourth and fifth kind. So, as we know, classical conditioning is when we are getting some kind of previously neutral stimulus, or neutral means it gives us no reaction at all. It is now going to gain the power to cause some kind of response that wouldn't have happened beforehand. We know it all started with Pavlov. Remember, Ivan Pavlov. There was a video clip in the PowerPoint I originally uploaded for this chapter if you forget about him. But when you remember a name, when you think of classical conditioning, you have to think of Ivan Pavlov. The biggest thing you want to make sure, I know there are a lot of applications as far as chapter 6 goes, application with trying to determine the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So do be sure you go back and review those examples. There are plenty of them in your packet, and you can find a lot online as well. So remember, the unconditioned stimulus is some kind of stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response, meaning it's unlearned, completely unlearned. It gives you an automatic response, okay? Like the example with Pavlov is, we know that the dog's food gave an automatic response of salivation, right? Unconditioned response then is just the response, the automatic, unlearned response. And as you know, I have that a turtle drooling, but the same kind of thing happened with a dog, that unconditioned, natural response that's going to occur. After learning takes place, after the conditioned stimulus is presented before the unconditioned stimulus, then we know that we have no learning has occurred. The conditioned stimulus was previously neutral, but now because it's paired with the unconditioned stimulus, we know that it's going to give us some kind of new response now. It's going to trigger a response. So for Pavlov's dogs, remember, he paired a small bell, or sometimes just the presentation of the bowl, or even sometimes the walking, the sound of his feet walking on the floor would become a conditioned stimulus for those dogs. The conditioned response then is the learned response. We didn't have a response before, and now we do. Remember, most of the time the unconditioned response and conditioned response is the same. Also, make sure that you remember that the stimulus is a thing, okay? It can't be an action, and the responses are an actual action, some kind of response, okay? Pavlov, we know, spent the rest of his life outlining 5 different other ideas. Acquisition, we know, remember that's the initial pairing of learning, and I'll talk about this more in a second. Extinction, we know that's the extinction of learning, meaning it's no longer existing. In case of classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the unconditioned stimulus, so there's no longer that new response happening. Spontaneous recovery then, this is after the extinction process has occurred, and all of a sudden, it might be months later, or even days later, that this response is going to happen. Then generalization happens as well. That's when we're talking about learning. I think the best example of this is when we talk about little Albert. Remember, that's a little boy who was afraid of rabbits, and then all white things, all white fluffy things, even that creepy mask that the guy was wearing, right? All those things because he generalized. And the opposite of that is going to be discrimination. If we think about the case of Pavlov's dogs, they would only respond to a certain sound of a bell ringing, not the sound of all bells ringing, right? Okay, I added these slides in here. I'm also going to upload this PowerPoint with this video, just so you can kind of remind yourself. Remember, when we're talking about classical conditioning, and this is a question a lot of you got wrong, the conditioned stimulus is presented shortly before the unconditioned stimulus, okay? You need to know that the conditioned stimulus is going to lead to you that unconditioned stimulus, that thing that gives you the automatic response. And we know that, yes, timing matters. They must be close together, so we understand that there's a connection there. Especially for animals, this is necessary. Higher order conditioning. Again, a lot of you are kind of confused on the application of this question. Higher order conditioning is a new neutral stimulus is becoming, it's associated with the original conditioned stimulus. So let me give you an example, okay? Let's say that we know that the pairing of the bell with the food for the dogs with Pavlov, we know that that was a classical conditioning, right? But if Pavlov wanted to, if he, outside of that situation, then paired the sound of a bell with, let's say, a clap or something like that, okay? The dogs would learn that the clap signals the bell, which signals the food. So they kind of see that hierarchy there of things that are happening. Sorry, Toodles is in my way. Okay. We know that extinction, right? That's the diminishing of a conditioned response. Think like the dinosaurs, right? They went away just as this learning, okay, Toodles, would go away. We know extinction is not permanent because of spontaneous recovery. Think of like a jack coming out of the box all of a sudden, right? It's after a rest period, but an extinguished conditioned response is recurring now. We talked about generalization, right? Again, the biggest example is little Albert when he's kind of pairing together all those white, fluffy things that generally weren't scary to him before. Discrimination, we know, is that opposite, when we can distinguish between the conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that are similar to it, but we know it doesn't signal the unconditioned stimulus. Operant conditioning, I've included the video in here again. Remember, this is Skinner. This is the idea of the pigeons and the boxes and pecking. This is where these ideas are coming from, okay? So operant conditioning, this is where we understand what consequences follow our actions. And remember, consequences isn't necessarily a bad word. Don't think about consequences like this. But operant conditioning, we know a behavior is going to be strengthened if it's followed by a reinforcement, or diminished if it's followed by a punishment, okay? And we know we have negative and positive types of punishments and reinforcements. Okay, classical versus operant condition. There are going to be some situations where you need to be able to determine which of these situations is classical, which of these situations is operant. Because we know they both use acquisition, discrimination, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and extinction. But we know classical conditioning, you have to remember this. Classical conditioning is automatic. It's considered respondent behavior. It's stuff you can't control. There's no thinking involved, as it says in the PowerPoint, right? But operant conditioning involves behavior where you are controlling your behavior and it's guiding, your behavior is being guided by the environment and the consequences that follow your behavior. You can ask yourself these two questions. If the organism is learning associations between events it does not control, that's classical. If you're learning associations between behavior and resulting events, that is operant conditioning. Thorndike, don't forget his name, right? We have very, 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 very few laws in psychology, but his law of effect is a law, and it's kind of like a well-done law. He says that rewarded behavior is likely to recur, and obviously this is a key component of operant conditioning. So do remember the name Edward Thorndike and his law of effect. That's good old B.F. Skinner. Something else when we're talking about operant conditioning, think of shaping, where you can reinforce behavior that gets closer and closer to the goal. I think I gave the example in class of that one time I went to the creepy cat convention by myself, right? And what I saw was that these trainers had trained animals to first go up some steps, then go down the steps, then go through a tunnel, then go over some hurdles, right? The cat just didn't know to do that right away. Its behavior was shaped by closer and closer approximations to that behavior. The pigeons in the Skinner box, they would tap if they were trying to be taught to turn around, they'd turn a little bit, get a treat, turn a little bit, get a treat, turn a little bit, get a treat, and eventually those closer approximations would get them to turn all the way around. Reinforcers, we know that we have positive and negative reinforcers, but a reinforcer is any event that is going to strengthen the behavior it follows. Think of those little hole reinforcers, right, that you can use to reinforce paper. It is strengthening that bond there. We have two types of reinforcement. We have both negative and positive reinforcement, okay? But don't forget, there are primary reinforcers. Those are things that are innately reinforcing. We come out of the womb knowing that we like food, right? It fulfills a need in us. We know that if we touch something hot or something's going to give us an electric shock, we're going to have an automatic response that we don't have to learn that. But a conditioned or secondary reinforcer, what happens is that it is associated with a primary reinforcer. So we don't know that grades mean good things. We don't know that money means good things, right? But because we associate it as a secondary reinforcer with a primary reinforcer, it becomes the reinforcing to us and can help strengthen a relationship, strengthen a behavior. So, positive reinforcement. We know that positive reinforcement strengthens a response by presenting a stimulus after a response. If we break that down, that means if I want a behavior to continue, I give something positive, some kind of positive stimuli so that you are more likely to do that behavior in the future, right? That first question you ask, is it making me more or less likely to do this behavior? And with positive reinforcement, we're more likely because we are adding something. Negative reinforcement, remember, negative reinforcement does still strengthen a response, right? But what it does is that it takes away some kind of aversive stimuli, something you don't want. So let's say everyone got 5s in their reading quizzes all unit. I'd say, okay, we don't have to take a test. I wouldn't actually do that. But that would be a negative reinforcer. I'd take away something that you don't want to reinforce the behavior of you guys reading and getting these good grades. Punishment then. Punishment always decreases a behavior, okay? Positive punishment means I am presenting something bad, right? Like Homer's yelling at Bert. I'm presenting something bad, so that is positive punishment. You're less likely to do the behavior in the future because I'm adding something negative or aversive that you don't like giving you chores or something, okay? Negative punishment means I'm taking away something good or desirable. If you came in late from your after your curfew and your parents wanted to decrease that behavior in the future, they could take away your cell phone, they could take away your car keys. This would be a kind of punishment because you'd be less likely to do this behavior in the future. Insight learning, this is kind of like insight when we're talking about problem solving, right? It's suddenly just the pieces fall together and we perceive the solution. We suddenly just see it, it just comes to us. Latent learning, don't forget the one thing, cognitive maps. These are mental representations of mazes. It could be for rats, right? But I think I talked about in class is I think we could all in our head picture a map that led us from school to our house, right? We could see that map in our head, and if one road was closed, we'd be able to use the other roads to get home because we're using a cognitive map. One thing that some people got wrong on this test, and I want to reiterate with you guys, there's something called instinctive drift. Where animals are going to drift back to kind of their innate behaviors that are natural for them, and we know that biological predispositions constrain learning. Monkeys can't fly, unless we're talking about the Wizard of Oz, right? We can't teach a monkey or we can't train a monkey to fly, right? Because that's not natural for them, they can't do it. We can't train humans to jump 10 feet in the air, okay? You're more likely, obviously, you're going to do behaviors that you are used to doing. Observational learning, we spent the smallest amount of time on this because it's kind of straightforward. We learn by watching others, okay? And the biggest guy we want to remember for this is Albert Bandura, for sure, okay? Mirror neurons, remember, these are these neurons, they found this by studying monkeys, that they make us be empathetic, okay? If you see your friend crying, you're going to feel empathy, you're going to feel upset because of those mirror neurons in your brain. Okay, memory then. We're moving on to chapter 7. Yay. So remember the first thing we did is we talked about the difference between recall and recognition, okay? Recall is when you have to retrieve information with your memory without really any retrieval cues or prompts. Remember I asked you, can you name